So hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson and I'm a registered social worker and therapist with over 14 years of experience as a social worker and 5 years as a therapist. In this video, I want to talk about narcissistic injury as well as narcissistic rage. And so these are core concepts of understanding why the narcissist, when they're going into these very strong outbursts, why they regress to this younger part of themselves, and then just the different behavior and tactics that you often see in these dynamics, particularly some of the darker elements in terms of the complete switch that you often see from these people and how vicious it can often be. And then what it means to be on the receiving end of that and how the narcissist and the scapegoat or the empath are different in this regard. So I'm going to be talking about narcissistic injury and narcissistic rage. So to first understand narcissistic injury, narcissistic rage, it's, I think, important to understand at the core of the narcissist is an identity disturbance and a void. You can talk about the false self and how when a healthier person, there's a term that everyone's crazy, but there's extra crazy and crazy. Those of us that are crazy but not extra crazy, there's still the ability to self-reflect and to make amends, even if we get upset or angry. Perhaps we go into fight or flight. We might say things that are rude or inappropriate, might even be considered emotionally and verbally abusive. But we all have defenses and want to see ourselves in a good light. Yet people that are not narcissistic, they're able to at least usually acknowledge what they did and they tend to apologize and self-reflect and also feel guilt and shame. But obviously with a narcissist, there's another core aspects of a narcissist is a lack of empathy. And so you'll find that they can be very vicious and cruel during these moments of rage and say things to very much attack our character. And usually it can be very relentless. And yet the next day, because there's been this ego collapse and they need to rebuild their false self, it's as though nothing happened. They tend to not acknowledge it or address it. I want to talk about what it means for them to have this switch, like a flip of a switch where they go into this rage, why this happens, and some of the common behaviors that you can see. So it's a sudden, disappropriate, and sudden transformation, and a very much terrifying transformation, in that the narcissist, their whole personality shifts, and it's seemingly coming like from an adult to becoming this tyrannical child. You can sometimes see like their eyes will go black, so there's like the disassociation. They have this like devoid of empathy. Their look is, it's like they're completely calm usually. Well, they're calm, but they're angry. And they can be very cruel with words designed for maximum harm. And the core behavior you often see is projecting onto you, accusing you of their actions. And that's just a very much an infantile defense as you accuse your opponent what you're doing. But there'll also be a lot of blame shifting, and they won't ever acknowledge that they're doing this. And there'll also be a lot of gaslighting. And the main reason they're acting this way is because of narcissistic injury. You've almost punctured their perfect image that they have of themselves, of the world. And so narcissistic injury is a perceived threat, real or imagined, to the narcissistic, grandiose, idolized false self. So common triggers are often objectively minor slights, disagreements, comparisons, or seeing another person's success. There's this fragile ego, and they don't have the ego strength to take these slights. It could be comparison, but they're overly sensitive to any kind of slight, especially if someone's more successful. It's a completely different reaction. So they make a mountain of a molehill, and the narcissist experience criticism not as feedback, but as profound, humiliating, and existential threat. So according to Sam Vakin, the narcissist is hypervigilant, constantly on the lookout for insults, and experience negative inputs as more real than positive ones. So they're always always have their back against the wall because there's this fragile ego that they have, and it's this false self. And so they make them out themselves to be this like grandiose person, but in reality, they can be very sensitive and can give a lot of criticism to others and be hyper critical of others, joking at other people's expenses sort of thing. But then if you mention or give them any feedback or poke them in any sense, like joke with them. Let's say it's they made a mistake, or maybe they're overweight or something, and they tend to be like they can go into this rage. It's a grandiose defense against a terrifying void that they have in them. So the narcissist personality is again built on the false self, and so that's this grandiose construct that they've created. And this construct is a defense mechanism against the deeply buried, wounded true self, which is experienced as defective, shamed, and unlovable. And the false self requires constant external validation, known as narcissistic supply, to maintain its integrity. A narcissistic injury is a sudden withdrawal of that supply. Yeah, I'm speaking more in terms of family dynamics, but yeah, if a narcissistic parent believes that you're no longer buying their false self, maybe you're not even intentionally doing it. Let's say there's another person mentioned and they're putting this person down, and you just say, I don't agree with you, then there could be a slight there, right? Because you're not agreeing with their false self. And it's one of those things they can't admit to it being like, they'll never really acknowledge any faults, because with the false self, any acknowledgement of it being a false self is seen as threatening. Because most of us, I think we can acknowledge that we have challenges in our life or that we're not perfect. And we can speak to those things, even if they're not something we always want to look at, or we might feel guilty or shamed about. And I guess we all exist on a level of this, right? I know for myself, I see this sometimes within couples when I work with them in couples therapy. There's usually defensiveness and criticism as the two horsemen. And again, particularly with men, this happens with women too, but if men, I guess, are feeling criticized, they can also go on the attack. And sometimes it can be understandable to some level. But at the same time, especially if you've done something wrong and you know you weren't acting with integrity, it's about acknowledging it. There's crazy and there's extra crazy. And I think that we all have our own challenges. A person who's more self-reflective and internalizes things will acknowledge and take some ownership of the situation. Whereas if someone's truly narcissistic, they can't acknowledge any of it, because that would mean that they acknowledge something of their false self not being real, or that their actions don't always match up with what they think about themselves. So it's the complete collapse, and they can regress to an infantile defense mechanisms and an infant defenses. So the false self is injured and the adult persona disintegrates. The narcissist regresses to a primitive infantile psychological state. This could be very young. And according to Lindsay Gibson, who wrote the book, The Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, she says these individuals use coping mechanisms and they deny reality and have difficulty regulating their emotions. Once upset, they expect others to soothe them. This also goes to, I'll talk a little bit later about the notion of a dual mothership model. So in some odd way, because the narcissist isn't a fully formed self and they regress in this narcissistic rage because of this narcissistic injury they had, they regress to this younger part of themselves and need others to regulate. In therapy and psychotherapy, there's a notion of self-soothing. That's also just to know that when we're dysregulated or in our fight or flight, in healthy ways, usually to take a break and separate yourself from whatever's causing the upset. And then it's the self-soothing that occurs. But with a narcissistic person, they don't have any off switch, and they tend to continue with the rage. And then after, they don't tend to acknowledge it. And that's interesting. And so according to Sam Vakin, he talks about this notion of the dual mothership model. And it's a little more complex, but according to Grannon, the dual mothership model posits that the narcissist casts their intimate partner or even their child into the role of a maternal figure. So there's co-idolization. You are the perfect mother, providing perfect supply, allowing for a fantasy of fusing and merging. Then there's the notion of devaluation. So this is an attempt to psychologically separate, so individuate. The narcissist must persecute and reject their maternal figure. The rage is reenactment of a failed separation from their own mother. So that's the understanding why the narcissistic rage occurs. And then there's the demand for sacrifice. So they could have a complaint saying that you never sacrifice like me, is a demand for you to abandon your own selfhood and fuse with them to perfectly regulate their internal state as an idolized mother would. It's just that they're not a fully formed self, because from a young age they created this false self and they never fully individuated. then they expect and need basically narcissistic supply to regulate themselves. So a narcissist always needs others to regulate themselves. Sam Vaknin talks about it being like a social disease. It's if it wasn't for other people, obviously, like if a narcissist is on an island, do they have narcissism? Or if they're in jail and they must be on their best behavior, there's some evidence that these people will change their behavior when they're on an island and they have no one around. And there's also there's just a notion that they have to have exposure to other people to regulate themselves, particularly with the narcissistic rage. They might devolve into this younger part and go into tears like a child would. But it's tricky too, because that's the false self. It's like this needing child, and you might have empathy for that child in those moments, or you might think that this is very off, like really odd. It's just to understand, usually in these situations, there's this ego collapse and they're regressing to this younger part. And then they're usually being very vicious in terms of defending themselves. And again, Carl Jung talks about the shadow. So all the things I hate in myself, I now see in you. When someone's really angry in this narcissistic rage, I guess we all project our shadow sometimes, right? None of us are free from our shadow, but a narcissist will really do this. You'll really hear that them like really accusing you of what you like objectively see them doing. So in the regress state, the unconscious is breached. The shadow, the repressed, disowned evil parts of the self is projected onto the target. So their shadow is projected onto you, and they feel justified because they think that they are justified, and because you're mistreating them and you've had this injury to them. And so they very much feel like they're justified to harm you. This explains why the narcissist accuses you of the very things they are doing: bad intent, malice, cruelty, abandonment. This projection explains the demonic quality of the rage. It's this raw, undifferentiated, angry of this primitive psyche, weaponized and aimed at the external target. The narcissist demands a total fusion. The differentiation of self is the ability to maintain one's own thoughts and feelings while in a close emotional relationship. The narcissist exists in a state of extreme low differentiation. They are emotionally fused with their primary partner and operate within the undifferentiated family ego mass. This is a state with no personal boundaries, where everyone is expected to feel and think the same thing as orchestrated by the narcissist. And you attempt to have separate opinions, feelings, or reality is perceived as the ultimate betrayal, threatening the fragile stability of the entire system. So that's why when they're criticizing someone, you don't necessarily agree with them. You might just say, oh, he's not that bad, or I didn't think she did that. Maybe you're mentioning someone else and they feel that person's a threat to them. If you agree with that person, or at least see some of the good in that person, they might think you are disagreeing with their false self, because they lack boundaries with the external world, and because they convert you to an internal object. It's like they're rebelling in themselves and against this bad object that is not performing and not going along with the way it wants to. So the narcissist will go into these rages, and they'll often also do blame shifting and gaslighting. So narcissists will insist you cause the rage, provoking them or imagining it entirely. As Bill Eddy notes, they have a target of blame for their problems. So there's no accountability. They won't accept any flaw in the false self, causing another collapse. Therefore, they will never truly apologize or acknowledge their behavior. The target's apology, however, is eagerly accepted as proof of their disordered narrative. And so the scapegoat's burden, so the prolonged exposure of this kind of cycle of abuse you can consider a complex trauma, sustained interpersonal abuse that occurs. So symptoms include being hypervigilant, emotional dysregulation, and a shattered sense of self. The target's response, arguing back, yelling, taunting, is often considered reactionary abuse. I would say it's a desperate act of self-defense, not as a premeditated attack meant to harm. The critical difference is the target feels remorse and seeks to repair the connection. Their goal is to stop the pain. The narcissist's goal is to annihilate the threat and reestablish dominance. They're basically a bully. They, like Sam Vaknin says, they introduce death to those around them. And so it's really about annihilating you as a separate object. And so sometimes that's what is the cause of this rage, is that you are asserting your identity and becoming stronger in your own differentiation. The narcissist can't stand that. They'll idolize you and need you as a scapegoat or to be projected upon in terms of the shadow element. But then they also, the fact that you're healthy and you're relatively healthy, right? We all have our issues, but at least you're able to self-reflect and they see that goodness in you. And so they must attack that and annihilate it. And there's different ways to look at this too. You can take Sam Vaknin's view of the malfunction. So it's largely an automatic defense mechanism. He describes narcissists as a malfunctioning AI, living in a virtual reality and interacting with internal objects, not real people. The rage is a defense protocol to protect the false self from collapse. Whereas a more malignant psychopathic view, in terms of understanding malice, for those who are comorbid, have antisocial traits, there is a conscious intentional element of cruelty and a sadistic desire to dominate and harm. But a psychopath, according to Sam Vaknin, is more intentional and they know what they're doing. Whereas according to him, a narcissist is defending their false self. And they also have a they're semi-psychotic, he says. They merge with the world and they don't see you as a separate object and internalize you. So they're really raging with themselves. But obviously you're on the receiving end of that. Perhaps as a scapegoat, you might react and get dysregulated too and maybe say things that you felt you shouldn't have said, but acknowledge that you did say something. But anyway, it gets to a point where there is a difference, obviously. But if you're not fully differentiated, you might continue that cycle. It's important to go no contact or low contact. That gets to my next point, finding yourself where they end. The primary task for the survivor is to achieve differentiation of self, the direct opposite of fusion demanded by the narcissistic system. This involves strengthening the ability to think and feel for yourself, even under emotional pressure, separating your reality from the projected narrative and gaslighting, and establishing firm emotional and physical boundaries. And then you can obviously do shadow work, Carl Jung's, I mentioned before in other videos, as well as internal bonding therapy, internal family systems, and understandings of complex trauma and different ways to build up your self-worth and not be so dependent on external validation. This is all aspects you could consider when freeing yourself from this narcissistic rage that's occurring from perhaps your parent, or it could be in a romantic relationship. Healing is not about fixing the narcissist or winning the argument. It's about exiting the dynamic entirely, both externally and internally. The journey is about moving from a life of reacting to a life of creating your own reality based on your own values and authentic self. This process transforms the pain of the past into a profound source of wisdom. The breaks do not diminish you, they become part of your strength. So I've talked to some of my clients and they mention how, again, I had this one guy I was talking to and his father, he believed very much as a narcissist, and they owned working together and they had a business. He mentioned that it was a very small town and a lot of people knew each other. It seems like he had to interact with his father, or at least according to him, he said that he didn't want to become like his father. That's the thing with the narcissist. They want to merge with you and convince you that you're no better than them. They're in this regression and trying to pull you down into their orbit. They want to convince you that you're basically like them. And they want you to sacrifice yourself to their false self. Likely you've stood up to them and have differentiated. And just simply being your own self sometimes, it's just, that's what the slight, they see it as a threat. That's why narcissistic rage or injury is a cause of that. And just the fact that you do, that you have this resiliency and integrity of yourself. And so they must attack you to make sure that you're not becoming powerful or not agreeing with their false self. This is just understand this different dynamic. Or your dad, when they do this and it's a complete switch from maybe how they were before, and you don't, at this time, it doesn't make sense because it's like, it seems such a big reaction from such usually a small thing. And it's typically very vicious. There's the notion where you've seen their eyes and they can disassociate and it's like being someone else. It definitely shakes you to your core if you've been on the receiving end of that. If you've been through that many years, you can understand that a child can have complex trauma around that, and you could probably maybe have suppressed that maybe growing up. And so there's some of these memories that also could be suppressed. Just to know that when these situations, it's to limit contact or go no contact. Understand you're likely never going to get an apology probably from them. And I guess in some sense you can feel sorry for them because they're acting like a child, right? And typically it's to those nearest and dearest to them. They won't obviously want to show others that and it to be seen by others. Other aspects to mention too is that this is usually more with a grandiose narcissist Whereas more covert narcissists might have their rages. It would be more, I would usually contained, I would say, and it's usually aimed at manipulation and like character assassination and yeah, just more passive aggressiveness. So they don't tend to be overt with their narcissistic injury and narcissistic rage, but definitely they're overly sensitive usually. And when they feel slighted, they will, I think, really go after you in terms of usually behind your back or in subtle ways, in ways that what they say to you, they might compare you to other people, but very much in more passive aggressive ways. So as you know, there's a difference with narcissists and how they operate. In this video, I talked about aspects of narcissistic injury, narcissistic rage. I hope this video was helpful to give you some understanding, at least from my perspective, working with clients and my own experience, to give you some understanding and some insight in terms of understanding why this occurs and so that you can protect yourself in the future. And at the end of the day, you don't obviously want to be around these kind of people if they're like this. And so it is very much limiting contact and going no contact. And then it's also maybe processing those memories and those emotions that occurred for these experiences. And you can do that with a licensed therapist and someone that you can trust, maybe it's a coach, but someone that understands this dynamic and really understands this like narcissistic rage and narcissistic injury. So if you did like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks and have a great day.